Welcome to this short lecture on utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is one of the main, most common ethical theories. And well, ethics is about our moral obligations, what we owe to each other, what I should do, how I should live. And what philosophers have been doing is to think about, to try to understand better why we would have certain obligations, and maybe also to give some guidance if we sometimes find that we are in an ethical dilemma and we have to make difficult choices. And the theories I will be presenting today, utilitarianism, are different approaches to these issues. So in this short lecture, I'll talk about utilitarianism, in other lectures on deontology and virtue ethics. And these approaches, these theories, in a way have a more theoretical aim and a practical aim. For philosophers, maybe the theoretical aim is most important. Those theories try to explain what makes right actions right and what makes wrong actions wrong. That's a bit of a sort of funny question because you know stealing is wrong. Well, why have to think about that? But this is what philosophers often are doing, to ask questions about things that we normally simply take for granted. Why is it so that I should keep my promises? This is maybe not a self-evident question, even though it is for all of us, hopefully, obvious that I should keep my promises. And if we have a better understanding of what the grounds are of such duties or obligations, then maybe this also helps us when we have to make difficult choices. So maybe such an approach, such a theory also helps us in practical moral decision-making. So let's see, and let's take a look at the first of the three theories I've mentioned, utilitarianism. Prominent utilitarians are Jeremy Bentham, well, can be seen as the sort of founding father of utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, and in our days, Peter Singer is a famous moral philosopher who is also taking all kind of quite controversial stances in relation to poverty, climate change, euthanasia, etc. And maybe this is a bit of a sort of common story for prominent utilitarians, because this approach does not take our moral ideas about what we should do or what we should not do for granted. They have a particular idea about how we should live, and a very strong idea, a forward-looking idea. And I think for all of these philosophers, you could argue that they were a bit ahead of their time as well. Jeremy Bentham was already arguing that we should also that we also have obligations with respect to animal welfare, for example. John Stuart Mill was famous for arguing and promoting in his work equality between men and women, for example, which was certainly not common in the 19th century. And Peter Singer is well known for his work on animal ethics and his work on climate change, for example. So let us take a closer look at this approach. First of all, utilitarianism is consequence-based, or we also call it sometimes a consequentialist theory. And that means that the moral right choice, the things that we should do and what we should do, this fully depends on the consequences of our actions. So we don't have to look back. We simply have to think about, well, okay, what will be the consequences, and are those consequences good enough for me to act on this particular situation? But how should we evaluate those consequences? Well, for utilitarians, that would be in terms of well-being, and then the well-being of everyone. And in this sense, it is indeed strictly impartial. Everyone is to count for one, and no one to count for more than one, Jeremy Bentham argued. So everyone counts as equal. And what we then have to do is to think about the consequence of our actions, and maybe also the consequence of all alternative actions, and to evaluate them in terms of what would be the best for everyone together. Because that is the next element of utilitarianism. It is aggregative and it's maximizing. So it's all about the greatest good for the greatest number. And we can all summarize this in the principle of utility, which says that we should always choose for the act that has the highest utility. And with utility, we mean here, it maximizes aggregate well-being or happiness, or in other terms, the total happiness of everyone concerned. So that is sort of the explanation of what utilitarian idea of the basis of morality is. But it also gives us a very clear steps of reasoning in case you are wondering about how to deal, what to do in a particular situation. Because, well, what we have to do, first of all, I have to think about, okay, what are the options that we have, the possible choices I could make. Then what are the expected consequences of all those options? Third step is to think about, okay, in all those options that I can do have certain possible consequences. I have to think about, well, what does that mean for the people, and not only the people, but also animals who are involved? What is the value of those consequences in terms of aggregate welfare, the welfare of everyone in total? And then finally, you have to choose for the option that has the best consequences in terms of this utility, in terms of aggregate welfare. This is, in a way, relatively straightforward. And Jeremy Bentham even thought that that's possible for us to sort of calculate, to measure and calculate with happiness. So he was talking about the philosophic calculus, that we could look at all our options and make choices. Especially governments would be able to do that, to look at different options, to think about, oh, okay, what will be the effects for everyone concerned? Are they worse off? Are they better off? And to bring all that together in a sort of large calculus, and then decide for the best possible action. Now, this approach, I think, has a number of really attractive features. Maybe the first one is, anyway, that it's all about happiness or well-being. And who would deny that happiness indeed is maybe an extremely important value, and maybe the most important value that at least people aspire to? Don't we all want to be happy and aspire to happiness? So that's one attractive aspect. The second one is that this focus on the consequences is also attractive. So what is right or wrong depends on the value of the consequences. So we need to look at the future. We need to look at the consequence of what we do, or for the matter of the consequence of what if we abstain from acting. That we should also take into account. And this is, of course, something that we normally do in our lives in all kinds of situations. If you make personal choices, maybe outside the realm of morality, you're thinking about okay, but what would be the consequence if I'm doing this? If you're thinking about what sort of study you want to choose, and to spend your life to some extent on in the next coming years, you will be, of course, thinking about, well, what study inspires you, what do you find interesting, but maybe you will also think about, okay, what gives me the best options for my future career, for example. So we do that in our normal lives. And then also the next step, the maximizing, that you aim to choose for that particular action that has the best consequences. Well, that's in a way also quite normal, you would argue. It follows also a sort of standard account of instrumental rationality. If we have several options, or if I want to pursue something, if I want to be happy, then it makes sense to go for that action that has the highest chance to contribute to the best happiness. So this, I think, how maybe people, if they are deliberating about their own choices in their personal lives, and actually we are often not so much deliberating, but if you would, then you would think, okay, it's a rational thing to, if you want to become a physician, for example, well, then it makes sense to start studying, then it's more effective and efficient to start studying medicine, for example. And maybe you can even think about what sort of branch within medicine then would make most sense. So think about efficiency. And there are even more attractive features of this approach. One, I think, also especially acknowledged by John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, is that this utilitarianism is well, we can apply it in our own lives. If I want to ask myself, well, what should I do? What sort of choice should I make in this case on an individual level? But we can also apply it on a collective or political level. It makes, of course, a lot of sense that that governments would ask if they are developing certain policies in relation to the control of infectious diseases, or in a way to improve the access to food in a country, that they do so with an eye on the interest of everyone concerned, and that they make choices that actually are the best for the whole population. And that fits nicely with utilitarianism, of course. And this approach finally also can be seen as the philosophical basis for all kinds of sort of methods for measurement methods and decision methods in economics. Think of cost effectiveness analysis, for example, cost benefit analysis. These sort of approaches in a way are, well, founded on utilitarianism and founded on the idea of that efficiency is important, that we can, that's all about human well-being, and economists would understand well-being then mostly in terms of preference satisfaction, for example. And so within economics, there is a whole branch that basically operationalizes this fundamental utilitarian idea. So far for about, say, the attractive features of this approach. But there are also some problems, and actually these are not small problems. And so maybe utilitarians, well, they can often choose either to deny that those are problems, or they have to sort of change something in their theory. And I think that the main problem is that if we follow the theory in a very strict way, and if we apply it in a very direct way, it will have implications that are really counterintuitive. That is, that it implies that we need to do certain things that intuitively we think, well, actually, that's not moral at all. And here again, we are in line with what I mentioned earlier, that I said, well, okay, Jeremy Bentham, Peter Singer, John Stuart Mill, these were people who were telling people quite controversial things. They were talking about equality between men and women, and that, well, most of the people in those days actually did not agree with that at all. And now looking back, I hope most of us would argue, well, actually they were right. And the same applies to taking into account animal welfare, for example, and many other examples. So it has counterintuitive implications, and we have to think about, well, what are then the consequences for the theory? Those counterintuitive implications are also very demanding. So one general idea that's often criticized in utilitarianism is that, in a way, it implies that we are as responsible for the consequences of what we do, the choice that I make, the action that I do, but I'm equally responsible for the consequences of when I decide, well, to remain sitting on my chair and do nothing. So if there are some people in need and I might have a possibility to help them, of course, when I help them, then I'm responsible for the consequence of that. If I am really helping and contributing to the welfare, maybe people will applaud my choice to help them. If I don't help them, and maybe those people will die, then utilitarians would argue, well, maybe you, me, are responsible for their death. And because I could have helped, but decided not to do so. And in a way, this, well, in this particular case, maybe it's not that, you see, it's not immediately as a problem, but it will also lead to really counterintuitive situations, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And the second counterintuitive implication might be that actually, according to a simple version of utilitarianism, you could argue that it's also acceptable to sacrifice the well-being of some in order to save or to contribute to the well-being of the many. So, and well, also that in all kinds of situations might feel unattractive, and can we really accept it? And some more, in a way, problems in the theory that actually are related to what I just mentioned is that the theory focuses on aggregation. It looks at the total sum of well-being. So it doesn't look at who is gaining and who is losing something. No, it just looked at the total. And that actually implies that, say, a small welfare gain for many, many people might be preferable from a utilitarian point of view to saving one or two persons in great need. And you can imagine that this is also, well, going against our intuitions. If you can help many people who are already well off a little bit and make them even better off, but there are thousands of people, then maybe you should do that because it's a better choice than helping two other persons who are in really great need. Can we really accept that? Isn't that in a way also too burdensome? And a final, a problem that I think is important, that's often mentioned, is that, well, the whole decision procedure, the 4 steps that I mentioned earlier, well, it looks at first sight quite straightforward. But in fact, of course, it's almost undoable. If I always have to think about all the things I could do, and then I have to make choices, which, well, I have to look at the possible consequences of all those options. And then I have to think about, okay, how well off will basically everyone will be, and what will be the total sum of well-being in all those possible consequences. Okay, and now I have to choose for the best option. Well, that's unbearable. That seems to be impossible. So let me say a little bit more about some of these issues. One is what I mentioned. So we are equally responsible for what we do and for what we allow to happen where we could have avoided it. And well, what I would ask you is to go to this link and watch this small animated video from the BBC that explains the trolley problem. Well, a well-known philosophical thought experiment that makes us really think about, well, is utilitarianism on the right track or not? So watch this video and you will see that, well, okay, maybe I have to accept that sometimes I have to do something which kills one person, but I can then save 5 others. Okay. But then an alternative comes where it seems completely sort of out of the question that you should follow a similar advice in the case of the man on the bridge. Well, you see it on the video. According to utilitarianism, because you only look at the consequences and not on the sort of act you do, that making a switch in the railway that effectually kills 1 person but saves 5 is in a way similar than pushing 1 man from the bridge in order to stop a running down trolley and then save 5 persons. Look at the video and wonder whether you can still accept utilitarianism. So these counter-intuitive implications have something to do also with the fact that only the consequences count. That for utilitarianism, it's not so relevant what exactly you are doing. What is important in our ethical evaluation is simply the consequences. And that leads to sort of funny situations. And another aspect that, well, that has that raises questions is this focus on aggregation. So we ignore about how welfare is distributed, making many people happy, a little bit more happy, maybe morally preferable to helping just one individual in great need. And well, I think there are all kinds of situations where we would ask, where we expect also governments to focus on the people who are in greatest need rather than doing something nice for the complete population. The idea that everyone is to count for just one and that we only look at the total impact, I think also raises some questions. Now, there's one of those problems that is rather unpractical. Can we really calculate aggregate welfare? Well, it's undoable, I said. Yes, it is. But at the same time, that does not take away that it is to some extent possible to model with, for example, preference satisfaction. And that's what economists indeed are doing. So it's, of course, we cannot fully oversee all the consequences, but we can say something about what we can reasonably expect, and we can say something about how it will affect human beings. So maybe it's not completely nonsense what utilitarians are suggesting. And even if full calculation is impossible, so the line of reasoning, so the nature of the arguments that we need to focus on, what factors should decide our decisions, I think is relatively clear here. So there are all kinds of problems that are related to the central features of utilitarianism. One way to save utilitarianism from these problems is that it might be that if we take all consequences into account and also look at the very long term, then maybe the implications are not always as problematic. If we really look at sort of remote long-term consequences, suppose everyone would act in these sort of ways in what utilitarianism is now asking of us, then maybe our society would feel rather unsafe or unpleasant. People would get would get worse off simply from that fact that they feel that they have to act against their intuitions all the time, for example. Well, if we take that into account, well, maybe then maybe utilitarianism itself would come to different conclusions. So that's one way to keep utilitarianism as it is, but in a way take a richer approach to what sort of we need to take into account in our decisions. And maybe a more really specification of the theory that would help us to avoid some of these problems is to go for what we call rule utilitarianism. This takes away some of the strict, maybe unpleasant elements away of utilitarianism. The idea here would be to say, well, it's not that you have to calculate about well-being in every situation. No, let's just agree about a number of general ethical rules that we should follow, that you should normally keep your promises, that you should respect other people, that you should help other people, or that you should avoid imposing pain or on animals, etc. And then realize that if everyone is acting upon those rules, probably that would lead to a very, a society in which our welfare is flourishing. So we could think about which rules should we all accept, which in total, if we act upon those rules, would lead to the maximum utility. That makes utilitarianism, in a way, a little bit more indirect. So to conclude, I think utilitarianism has a highly plausible, persuasive core. The idea that whether an action is right or wrong, well, I think at least partly depends on the effects on welfare for everyone involved. And that we have to think about what choices are better or worse compared to alternatives. I think that's a really important aspect of ethical reasoning. But there are also drawbacks, and I think we can also conclude maybe that it cannot offer a complete account of morality. Other values might also be relevant that cannot be simply reduced to well-being, for example. Think about freedom, biodiversity, justice, etc. And finally, some moral concerns that we have maybe cannot be fully reduced to thinking about the consequence of our actions. It might even be that sometimes what we do is morally wrong, almost independent of whatever consequence it would have. And we come back to that in the next lecture on the ontology.